So thanks for joining. We've got a paper, Author Meets Critics session on business and populism, edited volume by Magnus Feldmann and Glenn Morgan, who are here present. And we've got three critics, Jennifer Bair from University of Virginia, Valentina Ausserladscheider from Vienna now, but before PhD at Cambridge, I think, and Christopher Hartwell, Kozminski University, but also Zurich, right? So we have about 10 minutes for initial comments from you. And I suggest we go in the order of the program, which is a random, I don't know what the logic is. So it would be Jennifer first, then Valentina, and then Christopher, if that's okay. After that, so that's about 30 minutes, then you've had a chance to reply for about 10, 15 minutes, and then you have another chance to go get back at them, and then we open for discussion in the audience, okay? So without further ado, Jennifer, do you want to, so it would be good if you use the microphone while you're speaking, so that people online can hear it as well.
Great. Oh, that's okay. It's a nice background. Hi, thanks so much for the session organizers, for the invitation, and thanks to Glenn and Magnus for this book. So the first thing I want to say about business and populism, the odd couple question mark, I think the question mark is important, is that it's a big book. There are 17 chapters written by a total of 22 authors, so it defies, I think, sort of easy summary and characterization. But let me just say something, since I'm first, about the structure of the book. It has two sections in between an introductory and concluding chapter. Part one focuses on case studies, basically, with chapters on various countries, including the UK, the US, Denmark, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Romania, India, the Philippines, and Brazil. And then in the second section, the chapters are organized around key themes. So there's chapters on climate change, business associations, interest representation, trade, and then a chapter on the relationship between plutocracy and populism. I think one of the reasons that this volume accommodates such a wide range of case studies and topics lies in its definition of populism as a mode of politics that rests centrally on the distinction between the elites and the people, where, quote, populists claim to speak for a virtuous people, which has been betrayed and exploited by a corrupt elite. So in this sense, populism is as much about style as substance, and there's no real litmus test in terms of particular policy position. So as an ideology, populism is thin, eclectic, and flexible. And this conception, I think, allows Feldmann and Morgan to nicely cast a wide net in terms of encompassing within a single collection analyses of political figures, contexts, and issue areas that vary in important ways. In addition to its suitability for an edited volume of this sort, I think that the way that the editors are understanding populism also has the merit, considerable merit in my view, of avoiding the kind of concern with distinguishing economic populism from its supposedly cultural counterpart. In the immediate aftermath of the Trump election, there was a lot of investment in this distinction, including by some of those on the left who were committed to seeing in the embrace of Trump a sort of rejection of neoliberalism that could perhaps be shaped eventually into a politics that would be, if not fully progressive, at least far less pernicious than the kind of ethno-nationalism around which Trump's campaign was built. Some hoped that his election could be read less as an endorsement of Trump or less an endorsement of a kind of a positive vision of the white Christian America he wanted to restore, and more of a kind of nascent opposition to business as usual that could even blossom into a sort of anti-capitalist political imaginary. That optimism faded pretty fast, and not just among those of us who happen to live and work in a town, Charlottesville, Virginia, that became synonymous with the rise of white supremacist politics that Trump unleashed. The inseparability of the economic and cultural dimensions of right-wing populism, or more specifically, I think the fundamental reliance on what we call sometimes culture war issues, race, gender identity, and religion, to articulate positions on supposedly economic issues like trade and jobs is, I think, now pretty widely understood, and I think that understanding is conveyed in most of the contributions to this volume. The other fundamental feature of the collection that I should mention is the framework that the editors apply to make sense of the relationship between populism and business, or to kind of interrogate that relationship. They mobilize Hirschman's well-known framework of exit, voice, and loyalty to talk about how business responds to populism, and in particular, the threat that populism can pose to business interests. But even within these categories, there's variation. So instead of 3 categories, you really have 5, because you can have both quiet and loud voice, and both implicit and explicit loyalty. The Hirschmanian approach is not really an analytical thread pulled through the volume and woven into the chapters so much as it is a kind of overarching schema that underscores the agency that businesses have vis-a-vis sort of worrisome political developments, and the variation in how businesses use that agency. And I think that theme emerges with particular clarity in Daniel Kinderman's chapter on business associations. In general, though, I think, and of course they can correct me if I'm wrong, that Feldman and Morgan conclude that if one were required to offer a sort of general assessment of businesses' response to right-wing populism over the last 10 years, it would be somewhere between quiet voice and implicit loyalty. So having given the barest and the most skeletal outlines of the book, in the remainder of my time, I want to propose 3 questions to Magnus and Glenn. The first question is, what, if anything, might this book tell us about left-wing populism? The editors explain their interest, I think pretty convincingly, their focus on right-wing populism on the grounds that we know simply much less about how business relates to it, whereas there's a long track record of businesses responding to and organizing against the much more clear and present danger that left-wing populism is thought to represent. But left-wing populism, to my reading, kind of looms over the book as an implicit comparison, and I would have welcomed a more explicit discussion of it. Perhaps the clearest position on the distinction between the right and left variants of populism is taken by Brooke Harrington in the chapter on the plutocracy. Harrington writes, "This chapter explores the historical context and implications of the asymmetrical merger of commercial and political elites in right-wing populism. There is no left-wing equivalent of these fused interest groups." But even in light of the crucial differences between these political forms, I'm wondering if there are insights that this collection offers us for understanding the relationship between business and left-wing populism. And in particular, I'd love to hear if the editors think that the exit, voice, and loyalty framework could be similarly generative in looking at that relationship. The second thorny question, and in some ways, I mean, this is sort of the central question of the book, as suggested by the question mark in the subtitle. But the second question I'm hoping to push on a little bit is the question of whether or not we can conclude that right-wing populism really is a threat to business. And I think the editors are somewhat ambivalent on this point. There are probably many, but at least clearly 2 issues here. The first is, if populism is primarily discursive politics or rhetorical style, then we shouldn't assume that the promises made by populist leaders will be translated into action, at least not those promises that negatively impact business. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that the coming to power of right-wing populists has no consequences, but rather that those consequences may be less harmful to business on the whole than might be implied by the question, how should business respond to the threat of populism? In the conclusion, Feldman and Morgan note that Brexit and the Trump presidency, with its imposition of tariffs and migration controls, are obvious examples of the sort of uncertainty which has a negative effect on business investments. So this formulation refers really to 2 kinds of threats to business, both of which are discussed in their concluding chapter. The first is just the risk of uncertainty, right? So a business environment that's lacking stability and predictability, and the challenges that poses, particularly but not exclusively around investment decisions. The second, though, are actual policy decisions that hurt business interests, right? And so the question is sort of how many of the latter are there and how harmful are they? And I think if we're just talking for a second about the US, there are perhaps 2 areas of policy that loom larger than others in terms of negative implications for business. There's first, Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric was actually accompanied by a significant decline in both legal immigration and non-immigrant visas. The H-1A, the H-1B, the J visas, those are the ones that basically authorize temporary migrant workers into the US. It's much less clear that he was successful in curbing undocumented immigration, though that was the ostensible sort of focus of his rhetoric. Now, this was particularly troubling to businesses in the agricultural sector because some of them were, in fact, starting to turn towards the H-1 visas because they were worried about stronger enforcement of prohibitions against hiring undocumented immigrants. So that was a kind of a clear area where there was genuinely, particularly in some sectors, real harm to business interests and real concern about that going forward. Second, Trump's renegotiation of NAFTA as the U.S., Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, note the placement of the U.S. at in the first place in that title, did involve actually a really significant weakening of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that attracted a lot of critical attention in the original agreement. That's the so-called, Chapter 11, which had been deployed successfully by a number of U.S. corporations, suing for things like unrealized profits due to regulatory policies of the Canadian or Mexican government. That was actually maybe a little bit less widely reported on than some other elements of the NAFTA 2.0, but arguably a more interesting and consequential element. Much better known and widely discussed are the Trump tariffs. Now, to be sure, these were costly for some businesses, particularly U.S. farmers who are negatively affected by retaliatory tariffs that were imposed on their products. But I think it's relevant to remember that the ostensible purpose, at least, of those tariffs was to punish China for its failure to protect intellectual property rights, which reminds us, I think, that American business, while concerned for sure about disruptions to their supply chains for, say, Taiwanese semiconductors, are ultimately much more dependent on securing returns to the intangible assets that are the things that secure their location at the top of the smile curve, to use the GVC language. Moreover, to date, I think there's relatively little evidence that those policies precipitated significant shifts in the geography of production or the sourcing strategies of U.S. firms, and they're part of a broader set of trends, including sort of the reemergence of industrial policy that are part of the trade landscape. And so it's difficult to, I think, identify clearly the result of the Trump tariffs versus the other factors in that shifting landscape. Now, to be sure, in terms of disrupting trade and production networks, Brexit may be far more significant than the U.S.-China trade war. But the bigger question here is just, again, how much of a threat really is right-wing populism to business? The third and final question is, assuming that there are real harms to business, how should business respond? And I think here the book, again, is a bit ambivalent on this point, with the editors suggesting, I think, that it sort of might depend on context. Right. So on the one hand, there's evidence mostly from Europe that an organized response to business, organized response by business, can effectively forestall threats from policies promulgated by populist leaders and their allies. On the other hand, the chapters on the UK at points acknowledge that voice can be not just risky, but actually counterproductive. Right. So an example in the case of Brexit is when sort of politicians from the UK and elsewhere sort of highlighted the merits of EU membership, unintentionally providing fodder for Brexit campaigners to, quote, articulate a people versus the elite discourse. Now, this point was made most forcefully, specifically for politicians that were advocating Remain. But I think there's also some acknowledgments throughout the book that the same might be true, was true for some of the businesses that took that position. Certainly in the US, there is a discourse about woke capitalism that is actually shared somewhat by the left and the right, though the latter is far more likely to use it to, for example, criticize positions taken by companies that supported movements like Black Lives Matter. It will be particularly interesting, I think, to watch this dynamic going forward as, we are seeing a growing list of companies that have announced, some more quietly than others, a willingness to cover the travel costs for employees that have to travel out of state to seek abortion services. The overturning of Roe being a particularly stark reminder that that indeed populist politics and the sort of the allies they enable have consequences. The list of those companies includes Starbucks, Tesla, Yelp, Airbnb, Microsoft, Netflix, Patagonia, JP Morgan, Chase, Amazon, Walt Disney, Facebook, and somewhat oddly, I think, Reddit. Could corporate voice then, I guess the question is, exacerbate sort of the us versus them dynamic at the heart of right-wing populism? Or rather, since I think we know that it can, what are the conditions under which, that's most likely to happen? And if so, then are there options beyond Hirschman's triptych or a five-fold version of it that the authors lay out that we should be trying to identify? So the editors and contributors give us a lot to think about in this volume, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to grapple with some of these questions. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. It is a pleasure to discuss this excellent book today. And to be fair, it's been a bit of a difficult task because, you're being asked to make a critique. And actually, I think I can maybe offer some points of discussion more than a critique. So maybe that's a better framing of this. Since the analytical framework to assess business responses has been super interesting, I think the reconceptualization of Hirschman worked particularly well. Especially, I didn't know much about Hirschman. Somehow that did get excluded in my sociology curriculum at some point. So I'm glad that I got to learn about it and I got to, engage with Hirschman myself. I read through it, and so I really appreciate the reconceptualization there because I did learn a lot. And of course, the cases selected was excellent because it is cases that have been maybe a bit neglected to that extent. And of course, the business side of things has been largely neglected in the populism debate as well. So I'm happy that I got to read the book and to discuss it today. So to my 3 points of discussion. So the first one is going to concern, and I think I'm going to touch a little bit on what Jennifer just said, the definition used of populism throughout the book. So the authors chose to use a fairly broad definition of populism by building on the quite iconic classic definition on Moore's fin-centered ideology. Of course, it offers a particularly nice definition for the book because it is with these core elements that it defines for each of those populist actors and the adjacent policies that evolve around it, a neat way of going about it. And I think it allowed for this book to catch a vast array of different cases and have that under the umbrella of right-wing populism. And so that's convincing, I think, and the unifying element that that the authors say that these cases have all in common is this populist turn in the first decade of the 21st century. So far, so good. So we have chapters doing a historical comparison of what makes Trump populist when you look at the historical populism in the US. You have a chapter by Baltz focusing on the people and the nation construction within these populist powers. You have this rhetorical division between the people and the elite as a performance act, as you have written in your own chapter. So I think that the cases highlight the complexity and the multifaceted nature of all of these cases, which I think is the biggest contribution of the book, really. However, one could wonder whether this variety actually takes away from the analytical value that the term populism brings to these cases, right? All of these cases, I think, could potentially stand perfectly as insightful and as significant if they were to talk about nationalism, or if they were to talk about anti-system politics, or if they were to talk about the simple fact that they were traditionally oppositional parties who then got into government. So even the sort of discursive boundary work, when you talk about the division between the people and the elite, could be understood as a classic political mobilization, if you will, which is not specific to populism. Now, this is, of course, exaggerated here for the sense of discussion, right? And even the unifying moment of all of these cases has been interpreted as a more structural issue of liberal market economies, whereby this anti-system politics arose as a reaction which would fit the bill of anti-business discourse quite neatly, right? However, that being said, this is exaggerated for the discussion, I'll say. My second point is concerning the chapter, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation if I get that wrong, from Sani on the business capture by populist elites as the case they shown on Poland and Hungary. I think that chapter of the book is actually really, really important because it nicely shows that the populist elite is motivated by short-term personal self-interest as well, that they are business firm parties which present themselves as these people's parties, and that populist elites are very good at creating new opportunities for rent-seeking and legalized corruption. Now, one question that this raises, of course, is this potentially positive for business, right? And if we were to go with this working hypothesis, I'll say, it does raise a really important question of whether populism not just is beneficial for business, but what kind of agency there is within populism, right? So if we could potentially think of that agency as an implicit loyalty on the side of the populists rather than the businesses, right? So as an Austrian, unfortunately, I can attest in terms of Austrian political culture that this is certainly the case. That there are far-right populist leaders who are very happy to not just legalize corruption, but also who are very much implicit loyal to business, even if they drive a very hard economic nationalist anti-business discourse. I think that possibly could be a very important dimension to understand the interdependence of politics and business more broadly, rather than just right-wing populism and business. And finally, this sort of relates to my second point, but goes a bit more closely to the business responses, and again, touches a little bit on what Jennifer's already said. So as I said, my engagement with Hirschman has been thus far quite limited, but I did go and read it, and as I said, I really valued your reconceptualization of it. But if I understood this framework correctly, it is based on the assumption that market participants of whatever kind are able to make choices. And these choices are then threefold or fivefold. But I wonder whether these choices, exit, voice, and or loyalty, are really as open as it is sometimes implied in the book. So the authors do delimit. You do make exceptions here. You do describe that exit and loyalty can be voluntary, but they might also be forced. The authors describe that implicit loyalty is the most common strategy just because you have to navigate uncertainty, which I think is convincing. The authors write that smaller firms can be heavily reliant on local and national markets and thus cannot, or must exit, right? That loud voice can be particularly challenging or costly for businesses, and how different sectors were affected differently in terms of obvious examples. Look at manufacturing, look at finance. I think this comes out particularly nicely in your own chapter on Brexit. But I do wonder whether there is maybe some systematic indicator missing that would actually tell us something more closely about the structural indicators for businesses that clearly determine the kind of choices that business can take, right? So, for example, you do say that small and medium-sized enterprises do have a slightly more limited scope, but I wonder whether they have a scope at all. Of course, you can say, okay, they can exit market. Yes, they can, but that might actually not be a choice, right? So here I wonder whether there is a slight limitation in the way in which we do conceptualize business responses, in the fact that it might be very much about a more structural, is there profit, is there revenue, and therefore not just that it might be more strategic to be implicitly loyal, but actually not having a different option to go elsewhere. All of that being said, I'm going to stop here. And thank you again very much for this excellent contribution, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, it's going to be very, very hard to bat cleanup after those two excellent kind of commentaries. But I think the fact of the matter that I am an economist and I come at this more from the business side will provide a nice kind of complementarity to Valentina and what Jennifer said, especially with some of those last points that were raised. I'm going to also do something. I've already used an American phrase. I'm going to use another American phrase. We call it the compliment sandwich, where I start off saying what I liked about the book, I tell you what I hated about the book, and then I come back and tell you how I liked the book again. It's very common, especially in the workplace. So what I liked about the book, well, we've already heard some of the great things that have come with it. It's timely, it's topical, it's sexy. It's something that is very, very on point for today. From my own kind of point of view, the interest in the response, the typology of understanding how businesses react to populism is something that is underdeveloped, because political risk is making a comeback, whether it's kind of your expropriation from the 1960s, whether it's kind of now new geopolitical risks, et cetera, it's making a comeback. So it's crucial to understand how businesses respond to populism. But we don't really know. We haven't thought about this. It's only been in the past 2 or 3 years that we've actually kind of gone at it from kind of the international business side. What does it mean, practically then, to engage with, to fight against, the exit, the loyalty? How do we deal with it? Do we have strategic agility? Do we cultivate political connections, which is this whole other kind of literature in international business and finance? Do we go woke? Do we have fierce independence from what the populists are doing? Do we hide out? There's been some work done in this kind of area. Chen et al. From the Journal of Accounting and Public Policy says firms react to political uncertainty by reducing the amount and quality of information that is provided to investors. Or do you just keep a low profile, less money? You push money out the door so that you're not a political target. Farouk and Ahmed, 2019, from Research in International Business and Finance. We know that you need to have more dynamic political capabilities. Vit Henish at Penn has been talking about this for years. So the greater the uncertainty is, the more firms must wait for the information to be revealed, and the faster they must react to information once it's known. So opportunities need to be seized quickly, but they also have to be divested faster in this kind of where you don't know what the next tweet is going to be. You hold on, and then you let go faster. And then there's more time and effort that is devoted to information discovery, where it used to be predictable. Now, in this uncertain world, we have to spend more time finding out the information that we need to make informed decisions as a business. So the book, as already been mentioned, is structured around this specific taxonomy of these responses. Again, building on Hirsch from 1970. It gives the book an impressive internal skeleton. It holds up the country analyses. It holds up the thematic part. And I think it is the greatest kind of development and the greatest contribution of the book going forward. The taxonomy is well developed. It builds on previous work by the authors, and it's well grounded. Second, we've mentioned right-wing populism, and I think there was a great point about implicitly this has about left-wing populism. But I also agree that the authors give us a very, very good reason why we talk about right-wing populism specifically. First off, it's where the action's been over the past 10 years. Second off, it's conceptually very difficult to theorize, because right-wing populism is when right-wing acts like the left-wing, but maybe not culturally, but maybe economically, and maybe it's different in each case. But you end up with this ideological melange, this fluidity, that you don't really know where to put it. And we're still fighting in thinking in our staid ways of this is what left-wing is, this is what right-wing is. And populism just smashes through that. So this is very, very important that we look at right-wing populism. You can build a coalition amongst those who are anti-immigrant and those with economic anxieties about immigration, which is what we've seen with right-wing populism. We can still be willing to use the power of government to protect native interests, as Jennifer mentioned at the beginning and kind of talking about Trump. So you're all over the spectrum here. And left-wing populism obviously is still a threat, but the key point is that right-wing populism has been captivating developed economies. Right? This is what we talk about. This is the new wave of populism, is that it's been in Europe. It's been in the United States. It's been in UK. It's not just Latin America anymore. I've done some preliminary economic work in this with a whole host of others, a cast of thousands, if you will. And it shows that right-wing populists are actually worse for the business environment because they create more uncertainty. You know what you're getting with left-wing populists. You don't know what you're getting with right-wing populists. And I think that is something key behind this examination. Finally, speaking as an economist and someone who works at a business school, there's an emphasis on country studies, which is totally lacking. International business management loves these kind of cross-country, massive kind of panel regressions. We can't just go too far in depth. We want something that's generalizable. Here, we say, with something like populism, which is not necessarily generalizable, we can really delve in deep and see what is happening in each particular country. The Danish chapter, for me, was probably the most fascinating because it showed the adaptive abilities of a populist party. It was fascinating. I never think about Denmark. I work with a Danish guy. That's the only time I think about Denmark. But it made me think about how this actually would be generalizable in kind of a qualitative sense, thinking about the organizational structures, the institutional changes that happen to make populism relevant today. The Italian chapter was also a treasure in that it broke out firm levels, which Valentina just mentioned about small and medium enterprises. I think that was key, and I'll return to that in a few minutes. But it's crucial that we have the country studies because the new wave of populism is so context and so country dependent. Now, what I thought could have been done better. German quote for you from Nietzsche: "He who fights with monsters must take care that he himself does not become a monster. And when you gaze long into the abyss, it also gazes into you." It's very easy to kind of, as a policymaker, fall into this comfortable trap of fighting right-wing populism with left-wing populism. Well, of course, this creates even more institutional volatility for business. We can kind of see this in the United States. We've kind of been ratcheting up the populist ladder from George W. Bush to Obama to Trump to now even Biden. The substance of populism without the attendant noise, as Ganesh said in the Financial Times. Now that's okay, that's kind of policy. But as scholars, we need to be dispassionate. There's far too many times, I think, in this book, and I'll just give kind of one example, where we get the sense that the authors really, really hate right-wing populism, that we're not studying it, that we're just hating it, and this is how we're going to fight it. And I think the opening chapter of the case studies on Trump seems to be more collection of kind of conventional wisdom, popular critiques, and partisan criticism than serious scholarship. Some things, quoting Paul Krugman as an authority, if you quoted his American Economic Review or his Journal of International Economics papers, I would give that. Something he writes in the New York Times, not so much. It goes off in kind of this unsubstantiated history of business allying itself with far-right elements, which I think is debatable, is definitely disprovable, but doesn't fit. It doesn't really matter, because we're supposed to be focusing on Trump. For me, the biggest one was the assertion that the Republican Party has been an increasing unwillingness to acknowledge the legitimacy of its opponents. Now, I think this is a fascinating thing when we're thinking about populism in the United States. As I'll show, from some noted far-right outlets such as MSNBC, USA Today, NPR, and Politico, Democrats have been utilizing this for the past 20 years, kind of casting aspersions on legitimacy. They've never stormed the Capitol, though, and this is what Trump did. So is there a lesson here about what right-wing populism does? Does it build on a cultural zeitgeist? Does it build on cultural influences that were already there? Does it instrumentalize it, weaponize it in a different way? This is fascinating, and I don't know the answer to this. And it would have been nice to kind of seen that rather than what there was there. So back to populism, away from politics, back to populism. The chapter on Italy, as I said, fantastic for kind of breaking things up in terms of giving us the sense that businesses are far from being a cohesive, homogeneous category. It's true everywhere, and it's great that this chapter focuses on it. It would have been good, kind of following on what Valentina said, if the introduction emphasized this fact, that the choice of response would theoretically be heavily dependent on firm-specific factors, sector-specific factors. Valentina mentioned kind of whether or not you have the resources to be able to choose a specific response. This also sounds like a good empirical extension for other researchers. This is an agenda for further research. And it would have been nice if that was mentioned. Finally, as we've said, the opening chapters does a great job of setting up a taxonomy and emphasizing agency, and agency is not emphasized enough. However, there also needs to be an emphasis on events and people, since so much of recent populist success from the right wing has been enabled by factors outside of control of agents, businesses, and to some extent, political parties. It's been dependent on personalities. Populism, we've gone through the definition of what populism is. But why is populism? And of course, political scientists have a cottage industry on why populism is, sociologists as well. But we know it's kind of a result of these, as I've said already, zeitgeist, of these cultural undercurrents. But why is it successful electorally? It has something to do with personalities. It has something to do with events. The Italian chapter, again, hits on this point of Italian populism having always been with us, but finally getting a path to power with the global financial crisis. So can businesses react to specific forms of populism which emerge from specific events? If you have two wildly different types of crises, say a pandemic and a financial crisis, do you get different variants of populism? And does the uncertainty of populism depend on who is the populist leader? Now, I'm kind of plugging my own work here because Tim Deviney and I have written on we need to bring back personality into international business. We need to borrow from political science. We need to stop relying on this idea of semi-permanent and actorless political institutions. But again, kind of plugging my own work here, but it's something that we also need to understand why populism is to understand how populism is. So to conclude, book is great. I mean, it fulfills this important niche in understanding the nexus of business and populism. Populism is nowhere near finished. Unfortunately, there's the spoiler alert, because I think elites remain as out of touch as ever. So are we back to the 1970s? Have we just moved Latin America up? Did neoliberalism fail? And actually Latin America, the kind of the state-centered development, is that now our future? I don't know. I don't have the spoiler alert for that one. But the taxonomy that's offered is an excellent way to think about business responses, provides the reader, the book, with an important backbone for the case studies which follow. That the chapters, for the most part, balance and give us an important glimpse into the varieties of populism around the globe. So if anything, this challenges us, you out there, well, not necessarily you, but it challenges us as scholars, as researchers, to undertake more empirical work to see if we can understand what's going on with firms, if we can understand these responses. I'm on it, and others are, which is heartening, but I think there needs to be more work in this vein. So thank you.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank all three discussants for these really excellent comments. Very, very, very useful and very thought-provoking. I think it will give us lots of food for thought in terms of thinking of our own future work on this. And I obviously really appreciate your overall assessment and all of the advice you've given. So thank you very, very much for engaging so closely with this very big volume. So let me try to begin here by picking up on a few points that I thought were particularly interesting, or that were that you've asked us to reflect more on. So I'll go roughly in the order of the three sets of comments. So the first point you raised, Jennifer, right, on left-wing populism, whether this is sort of the elephant in the room here, whether this framework could actually apply to left-wing populism as well. I think that is a very good prompt. I mean, that is something we have started to think about. I mean, I think the volume would have been, I think, even bigger if we had tried to incorporate that in this volume. But I think the framework as such could potentially apply to left-wing populism as well. I mean, that would be my expectation that it might do, and that it would be interesting to explore that empirically. Because I think even though for the reasons we try to spell out, we expect we think right-wing populism is a more urgent task to explore at this stage. I mean, it is likely that some of the mechanisms and some of the factors, in particular, that affect business could be similar. So I think I take that as an invitation really for future work, and I think that's a really interesting question. On the second question you raise about whether right-wing populism really is a threat to business or not, and you suggest that we are a bit, we hedge our bets a little bit here. I think the key challenge here is also a contextual one. I mean, I think what we have found as we've looked at this, and this is something, of course, that emerged from all three sets of comments, right? That it is quite hard to generalize. So there is a challenge here in terms of approaching this topic, of finding some degree of generalization whilst acknowledging the fact that there is that populism, due to differences in particular leaders, in particular agendas, in particular contexts, right? The points that Christopher raised as well, right? I mean, populism will not operate in exactly the same way at all times and in all countries. So I think the points, I think the 2 points that you identify, I think, are precisely the ones we wanted to get across. The increasing uncertainty on the one hand, which I think comes close to being a constant across cases, but I think in terms of the actual policies, we do find quite a bit of variation, and I think this is what complicates the assessment. So I think the degree of threat to business probably is not constant, right? And that's probably why we haven't been able, I think, to make a firm generalization on this point. Your last question, Jennifer, I think is a really interesting one about how business should respond to the extent that it views it to the extent that it does view it as a threat. And here, obviously, this is sort of looking beyond the book a little bit, but I think the answer, my preliminary answer would be that it's maybe not so much a question of a completely different logic of responding, but I think it's maybe a case of more skillful, creative use of existing mechanisms. I think there's a lot business could do, for example, by using quiet voice and reaching out to politicians, potentially in novel ways, meeting with politicians in different ways, reaching out to government actors, utilizing business associations in new ways and so on. I think there's a lot there about the particular tool. Also, the ways in which the media is used, including social media. I think all of these things can be harnessed in novel ways. So I would expect really that creative uses of existing responses would be where I would be looking for these sorts of options. Valentina, I think I think these were really excellent comments as well, and I think the point. I mean, the point about complexity I've already touched on to some extent here, but I think the point you made about the Hungary and Poland chapter here, about the new forms of interdependencies, I think this is really a really interesting point, and as you say, this could potentially apply even beyond populism. And I think this also, there's a nice bridge between this and some of Christopher's points here about different types of businesses. I mean, I think these kinds of interactions here between the populists and certain privileged businesses, I mean, they provide profit opportunities and benefits, but these benefits will not accrue in equal measure to all businesses. So that's where we see cleavages open up and contrast between different kinds of businesses, and I think that's really where I think Christopher's plea for and your plea as well, Valentina, for looking more closely, perhaps unpacking this further and looking maybe at the uneven effects on different kinds of businesses and different kinds of business mobilization, which I think some of the chapters do, but as you point out, this is something we could maybe have done or could do more of in future work. And I think this also relates, of course, to the last point about different kinds of of choices, right? That certain firms have more choices than other firms, and I think this clearly the challenge here is of sort of weighing up the relative importance of structural factors and this kind of the perennial structure and agency question that social scientists have been grappling with for centuries, of course. So thinking through this, what this means in this context, I think is not easy, but I think I agree that that's clearly where one needs to go. I've already touched on quite several points you made here, Christopher, in the context of the others, but I think just wanted to maybe flag up a couple here more. I think the point you made here about the ways in which populism blurs sort of existing understandings of what left and right is, I think is really quite an interesting point, and I think it creates what's interesting about this is that it gives populism some of its potency in terms of appealing to very different groups of people who, I mean, if you look at the Brexit coalition, I mean, this will include people who have never voted the same way, ever, right, in their lives, right? And we can see populists elsewhere. In Poland, for example, also use the way in which law and justice have, I think, appropriated or viewed as left-wing in certain respects by people in Poland, have, I think, added tremendously to their appeal. So I think this is, a really important point that makes populism quite challenging to study. But I think uncovering the way in which it creates new coalitions and perhaps realigns societies and electorates, I think is a really important and important issue. I mean, on the point about studying firm and sectoral level differences, I mean, I would fully agree that this is, of course, the book tries to do that to some extent, but I agree that there could be more work on this and on the sort of structure and agency and events dimension as well. On this issue about being passionate and dispassionate, I mean, I think it's hard with a topic like this where people obviously we don't, of course. A lot of people writing about this will have very strong views about it, so that I think is a challenge, I think, and of course different social scientists and different social science disciplines and traditions within disciplines navigate this in different ways. So I think I will perhaps leave it at that. I think Glenn, don't want to take away time from Glenn here too. But thank you again for these excellent comments.
Thanks, Magnus. Well, I wanted to start again by thanking people for reading the book. And I want to explain to people in the room there is no book yet. And so colleagues had to read a PDF version of it. So if you're desperately there in Amazon looking for where the heck is this book, are they having a joke on us? It's somewhere in India being processed. So I'm sorry about that, and I'm sorry that you can't get it yet. And to be honest, we haven't heard exactly when it will be coming out, but hopefully in the next few months. Yeah, because on our side it's finished, but production's taking a bit longer. Yeah, so thanks very much for these comments and questions. I think I wanted to maybe take a little bit of a general contextual approach to some of the questions by sort of re-emphasising what's not been said yet. Maybe it's just perfectly obvious to everybody, but this phase of populism is associated with the collapse, in a way, of neoliberal ideas and neoliberal policy making, and the crises that have emerged since the global financial crisis, since the Eurozone crisis, and more recently, with the pandemic, etc., that populism is a response to the inequalities people have talked about left behind, but it's more than that. It is those left behind people, but it's also those very wealthy people that have benefited from this. And it's the anger of the left behind and the fact that the mainstream parties have been unable to address this that has generated the force behind parties that challenger parties, but also parties like the Republicans that have changed from within. So, this has to be the background. Then you have to say, well, okay, what is populism bringing? And as colleagues have said, we go for this version of Muda in the first instance of populism as being light on ideology. It is very much about the elites versus the people and the populace claiming the mantle of being the people's representatives. And, we saw that in the UK, I hesitate to mention it again, on Wednesday night. As far as Boris Johnson was concerned, he was the people's representative. And cabinet ministers could come in, MPs could come in, chairman of the 1922 committee could come in and say, you must resign. And his response was, no, I won a mandate. I won this election. I am speaking for the people. Get me out if you can. Fortunately, there are sufficient pressures in the British system that by the next day he was out. But imagine if that had been a Trump character. Would he ever have gone? So, populism it's a performative art, I would say, that you have to look, as Chris was saying, about personalities, about how they perform their authenticity as being representatives of the people. And they don't perform that by tacitly accepting the rules of the game, tacitly accepting an independent judiciary, an independent university system, an independent media, etc. And one of the most important things, and this is where I think I link to the question of uncertainty, which a number of people raised, I think they create chaos in part by what they do to the mechanisms of government. And if you think about Trump and you think about how many regulatory agencies were put in the charge of people who hated that agency and its objectives, and then you think about the number of positions that were not filled under Trump of governmental agencies, and then the ways in which their presentation was changed on the website, and it's this, this destruction of the civil service, which maybe we didn't emphasise enough, but it's destroying the mechanisms of government which we have been used to. And that's, to me, it's not so much the unpredictability of their policies, but it's what they do to governance. And to me, the contrast is with the way that business worked before. And, some of this work started with our examination of Pepper Culpepper's notion of quiet politics. The idea that under neoliberal rule, the way that business got its ideas, its interests across, was by a form of, there was lobbying, but it was also by being the information carriers into government and shaping how government thought about policies behind the scenes, the quiet politics that Pepper talks about in his book. And this is what I think populists have shattered. That sort of network governance, quiet politics, and what they put in its place, and again, I think this think this relates to some of both what Valentina was saying and Chris. What they've put in its place, it seems to me, is almost now a court society. In other words, there are people who they make dependent on them by, in the Hungarian case, sort of privatising and then giving those organisations to their friends, who then become part of the court. And the exit voice loyalty, you get kicked out of the court if you are disloyal. And, Trump was exactly that sort of person. And that's why I think populist forms of governance come out to. And then just finally on this passion, dispassion, I think one of the things that concerns me, and it also relates to the woke capitalism point, is that for 2 decades, businesses have been telling us that they're trying to become more corporate social responsibility, that they take seriously human rights, the UN Global Compact, etc. And now we're in a situation, maybe I'm getting too passionate, where these things are under threat. And what do we get from business? Oh no, don't say anything. I'll talk to you about my CSR scores. I'll talk to you about my ESG scores, which show, how much committed we are to human rights. And then what happens? Well, as Jennifer said, in relation to Roe and Wade, we are now seeing the rubber hit the road in a sense. Are these companies really going to challenge, going to be allowed to fund abortion support, to encourage people to cross state lines, etc.? Anyway, so companies do have some really serious decisions to make, but I'm afraid, to me, the CSR discourse is just blown out of the ground by the failure to really tackle the populism issue. So I think this is a fundamental question about, are businesses serious about CSR? Are they serious about human rights? Are they going to confront, what will they do if they're challenged by the state of Texas on Roe versus Wade, etc.? So I'll leave it there. I didn't address the questions individually, but hopefully there's something there.
Thanks very much, Glenn, and Magnus, of course. So before I open to the floor, I think I'm going to give you the chance to come back to some of these points if you wanted to. Yeah,
something quick.
Do you want to stand up?
Yeah, just something quick to what Glenn said. First off, I don't come to praise Trump; I come to bury him. But the point on kind of the utilizing institutions for political uncertainty, the uncertainty comes about because of the use of political institutions. I think that's right. I don't think it's necessarily true in the case that Trump put, kind of like Rick Perry or people in charge of agencies that they hated. That's kind of a Republican thing. That's kind of mainstream right wing in the US. That's not necessarily populist. But the point that Tim Davidi and I have made before is that populists don't avoid uncertainty. They welcome it. They thrive on it. Trump loved it. I think Brexit has proven that as well. And you see this in the Philippines. Let's get out of the Anglosphere. Let's talk about the Philippines, Poland, where I have an appointment. They utilize the institutions precisely to create the uncertainty, and then businesses have to adapt. So it's not just about, this is some byproduct that comes about. It's something that is actually and actively part of the political process for a populist. And I think that is something key. Although the point about kind of the court system, kind of feudal or monarchical, I think is entirely right. And again, I used to be the president of CASE, Center for Social and Economic Research in Poland, for a couple of years, 2014 to 2018. And then, of course, Peace, Law and Justice came to power in 2015. And we had done work with the Ministry of Finance beforehand. We did work with the Ministry of Finance. Afterwards, even though we were associated with Leszek Balcerowicz, the architect of Poland's Big Bang theory, and so obviously he was a bad guy in Law and Justice's in their thinking. The people that we worked with at the Ministry of Finance up until that point were knowledgeable. They'd gone to Western institutions. They were good on economics and finance and understanding what needed to be. After that point, they were ideologues. They were absolutely of an immensely lower quality. And it took so much of our time to actually get them up to speed when we worked with them on discrete projects that it became not worth our while, especially since, we were going to be a political target anyway. So it is also something that is a tactic of populists. If you're going to vitiate the civil service, you get the people in there who are loyal, not necessarily the people who are good. So I agree entirely with that point.
Jennifer or Valentina, do you want to come back on any of the points?
I mean, I think I would just say,
Maybe just.
I would just say that I'm glad that the point about political institutions kind of came up in the response and then in this exchange here, because I do think that Valentina made the point that, you might be able to refer to any of these figures as nationalists as opposed to, or in addition to being populists. And I think one really concerning question is the degree to which you could start using the term anti-democrat to describe these folks as well. And so this question about the institutions and the degree to which they're holding, I think is a really, really critical one. And for the US case, at least, there has been, I think, a lot of relief about the degree to which, so far at least, there have been, the institutions have held. But to go back to the point that Chris made about personalities, there are also, as these hearings that are happening right now in the US are highlighting, specific individuals in particular positions that really are why the institutions held in particular moments when they did. And so the question is, at what point, when do we get a tipping point when in fact enough of those folks have been replaced by people within the court, potentially, that's no longer the case?
So we can open it up for questions from the floor, if there are any.
There's, of course, that quite interesting book by Bill Lazanek, where he talks about the split of different ways people make money. Predatory, which is basically predatory value extraction of one way or another, and more orthodox business in Adam Smith's sense, the word you buy and you make or sell goods or services, and how how the balance has come rather awry. Now, obviously, all business is not like that, but there is a class of business. Typically people who don't buy and sell things, who palpably, and this is not just being sort of whatever dramatic, in terms of the kind of things they say, the kind of think tanks the funds say, they actually have got serious doubts about democracy, and they do throw a hell of a lot of money onto extreme causes, and there is a lot of this sort of dark money in the system. I mean, that's part of the picture, obviously. There's to be something the other side as well, It's part of it's one side of the formula. But there's obviously something that's quite disturbing going on, that there is this very well organized and extremely well funded I live in Canada, and they've had that. There's protests in Ottawa. Now, the interesting thing about them was, they know that it's been well documented. The money came from the States. These guys were extremely well organized, had a hell of a lot of money coming in from the States, and they didn't achieve what they wanted to, but they were quite disruptive for a period of time, and that's a reflection of a broader malaise. There is this going on, that there are people out there who don't believe in democracy and have got a hell of money. That's part of the formula. And that's just quite an interesting sort of phenomenon, about trying to understand populism. There's something going on there, obviously.
Shall we take more questions, yeah? Are there any more questions from... Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hi. Sure. My name is Tiago Moreira Ramalho. I'm at ULB in Brussels. So I was not here for the very beginning of the discussion, so maybe I missed something. But I was wondering if you could perhaps expand on, because we have these broad categories of the relationship between populism and business. But I was wondering how these relationships actually can be disentangled in different types of business, and especially in different types of business affected differently by different types of uncertainty. What I mean by this is you do have, I would imagine that you have fractions of capital that, for example, rely on long-term technological skill that probably require for their operation what we could call certainty or less uncertainty, but you probably do also have fractions of capital that thrive on this uncertainty. So I wonder, especially in this sort of dichotomy between manufacturing industry and financial sector, especially when they are disentangled in some of these political economies, if the story is a bit different there. So uncertainty for whom, what kind of business benefits from this, and so on and so forth. And the other point, it's a tangential point, but I cannot help myself from making it. But I'm sorry, I cannot remember, Christopher. I could not remember your surname. In your discussion of these themes, you suggested that there was a risk of this equivalence of, or this sort of becoming oneself a monster. I do think that we have to be careful, however. This imperative of dispassionate analysis cannot prevent us from seeing what is actually different in these realities. And I do think that there is a strong analytical difference, not just a political preference, between characters like A or C or Marjorie Taylor Greene when we talk about individuals. And I do think there's a difference between questioning the reliability of American elections when we are denouncing the disenfranchisement of minorities, or when we are or the gerrymandering of a number of districts, or when we are just saying, plainly lying that, we won an election when we actually didn't. Because there's a lot of actually scientific research on the fragility of the integrity of American elections regarding a number of issues. And I do think that at some point we have to prevent the sort of absolute relativism of all claims are equivalent, because they are not. And I just wanted to make that point on a very side note. Thank you very much.
Hi. So, one question I have, which is a little bit inspired in some of the comments earlier, is whether countries with economies that are highly dependent on rent, IP is really important, like in the United States, or there is some kind of highly rent-seeking industry in that country, will that lend itself toward more support for populist leaders or not?
Thank you very much for all of these great questions and comments. I'll just maybe pick up on a couple of them. I mean, I think this question of different terms here and what exactly populism means. I mean, this is something that I think came up also it was very well formulated by Valentina, right, in her initial interventions as well, and it's come up now in a few of the questions. I think that is a really important issue, and I think the relationship between populism and a number of concepts, sort of adjacent concepts, right? I mean, you mentioned anti-system politics. I mean, Jonathan Hopkins, of course, has argued that we shouldn't be using the term populism at all because it is so problematic, and that's why he prefers the term anti-system politics. And there's clearly an affinity there. There's an affinity with nationalism. There's maybe an affinity in some cases with, anti-democratic ideas. There may be an affinity. Some have argued that there's an affinity with fascism. I mean, we could go on, but I think I think that probably it is useful to try to delineate these concepts, even though there may, of course, be overlap as well between them. But I think I would agree with this comment that actually looking quite closely. I mean, to me, the distinction between what is the effect on procedures and institutions, I think, should be quite clearly delineated from the impact from policies. I mean, I think that analytical distinction is absolutely central here, right? And I think, because I think, you know, as the question here from the floor also highlighted, right? I mean, we might disagree with certain. We all probably have some views on our preferred policies and so on, but I think the impact on institutions and governance procedures are potentially much more profound and go beyond any particular administration in presidential terms, and they affect the rules of the game in a much more profound way. And I think that distinction, I think, really needs to be at the heart of this. I really like this question about rents as well. I thought that was a very interesting question. I mean, one would I mean, we haven't looked at this systematically in the project, but I mean, one might conjecture, sort of a little bit building on, again, on some of the comments made earlier, right, that rent economies that are very reliant on rents might provide a very good opportunity for populism, right? Because you could, you know, rent disbursement could be a very effective way of potentially of building a populist coalition. So I think that is a really interesting, I think, conjecture that one would be worth exploring in more detail. Finally, I wanted to pick up on one of the points that I forgot to pick up on in my first round of comments, from one of Valentina's comments about the question of whether we could think about this framework in the opposite way, right? I mean, could we talk about implicit loyalty to business rather than the other way around? And I think I think that's a really interesting idea. But I think it is, of course, important to when we think about business choices here, I think it is quite important to I mean, I think the way Glenn and I have conceptualized the idea that there are business responses, I mean, this is premised on the fact that business has agency, has a certain power, right? Maybe it is affected and constrained in various ways by populism, but certainly there is a certain amount of agency there and a certain amount also of structural power. So clearly, I think it's not as simple as thinking about. It's clearly not as simple as thinking about business as some sort of passive respondent here. I mean, clearly, business can evoke some of these resources, and to the extent that business has considerable power or considerable structural power, right? I mean, it may well elicit similar types of. The government also has to respond in certain ways. So it's a really interesting idea to consider whether this sort of framework could capture that. I think I'll leave it at that. So give Glenn.
Maybe I can focus a little bit on this question of sectors and firms. I mean, in our analysis of Brexit, we make the point that certain sectors were supportive of Brexit and other sectors weren't. And when you look into the interests, I mean, for example, there was a lot seemingly of hedge fund money went supporting Brexit because, you know, they very much thrive on an uncertain external world in which they can act without the rules and regulations that they saw coming at them from Europe. So there's that sort of phenomenon that the media in the UK, the press media, much of which is owned outside of the UK, if not outside of Europe, also were very significantly behind Brexit because they didn't want regulation affecting them. We found that some of the port owners in the west of England were supportive of Brexit, in part because, they wanted more traffic with the US, and the docks on the other side, for whom the EU is more important, they were supportive of remaining in. So there's definitely sector effects. And one of the sector effects, coming back to your point, Jeff, about dark money in the system, is about extractive industries, that particularly in the US, concerns about the climate crisis, what that would mean for those pipelines coming from Canada, and the whole environmental regulation of oil and gas and those types of things. The Koch brothers, of course, were central to setting up putting a lot of money into the right-wing think tanks. And although the Koch brothers were not supportive of Trump in the first instance, I can't remember when one brother died or when it was, but eventually they definitely came round to supporting Trump as somebody who was going to be anti-regulation, anti-climate change. And that brings me to the third point related to what Chris was saying, that expertise has been so undervalued by populists, and that's partly populist performativity. Trump thought he knew everything. And he didn't need to... Again, it's this thing that you were saying about create confusion about what is the truth, and create confusion about who is an expert and why they should be experts. And of course, in the UK Brexit campaign, Michael Gove famously said, we've had enough of listening to experts. So, the populism can appeal to different sectors, it can appeal in different ways. The whole sort of, I am the voice of the people, Trump never talked very much about his qualifications, but he said, I love the ill-educated. Wasn't it some sort of quote like that? Yeah, and so populism, going back to this point that in relation to Valentina about, is it just a synonym for nationalism or whatever? I don't think it is. I think it creates a force field that is different from nationalism. You go to Asia and you can get the developmental state and all the rest of it, and a sort of high level of nationalism in South Korea, but it's organised. You go to what Trump was trying to achieve, and it was very much this sort of disorganisation and uncertainty. And then at the level of firms, I think there was a move to take seriously aspects of CSR and aspects of the greening economy amongst some sectors in the US. And of course they were confused maybe, or, what was Trump's lessons about greening the economy? Why, he didn't seem to believe in the climate crisis, and they'd started to invest huge amounts of money in it. And so the uncertainties that created there, the supply chain uncertainties, and also the HR uncertainties, to go back to this woke capitalism thing, companies that had been trying to develop a diversity policy, a policy on race and gender and sex, and there they were in a situation of being ridiculed by Trump and his acolytes. So, what were they to do? Another element of the uncertainties that they had to deal with And yeah, I guess the best option was to stay underneath the radar as much as you could and keep out of his eyesight. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Glenn. So before we conclude, we're nearly out of time. I just wanted to make one comment on, so I have to say most of the chapters I've only glanced at, but I think it seems to me there's sort of it came out in the discussions here as well, there's sort of an emerging opposition almost in terms of what are we looking at in terms of what is populism reacting to. And so I would say, on the one hand, Brooke Harrington's chapter, for instance, the quote you had is sort of in this camp that is becoming increasingly strong in Central Eastern European scholarship. And, for instance, Gabor Schering, sees populism as the logical extension of neoliberalism, not a reaction to it. And I think in your book, in the introduction, so forth, it's more the opposite view, which is also the view that informs my research on Hungary with Dori. And Dori's chapter is probably at the other end, where Orban is rejecting liberalism. It's illiberal. It's anti-liberal. But the role of business elites in this and the businesses that benefit from populism, lead some people to suggest, no, this is just, exploiting workers with new means. So David Harvey's type of neoliberalism reinforced, right? And I think, that I think is an interesting debate to take forward. I think in the next months, years, we're working on this phenomenon, I think. But yeah, I just wanted to abuse my chair's position to also give you my 2 cents on this. But I'm afraid, Jeff, we're out of time, I think. We need to conclude because I have another session in a minute. But thanks very much, everybody, for being here. Thanks to our speakers in particular.